He walked into that restaurant expecting a stranger. What he found instead was the one woman on earth he was never supposed to want, his ex-wife's mother. Mason Calloway stood frozen in the doorway of Alderton's, candle-lit tables blurring around him, while Victoria Ellsworth looked up from across the room and the color drained completely from her face. Two adults. One catastrophic mistake made by well-meaning friends who had no idea what they had just done. They could have walked out. They should have walked out. But neither of them moved, and that single moment of hesitation cost them everything they thought they knew about their own lives. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's find out just how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Mason had given himself exactly 45 minutes to get ready, which was 30 more than he'd spent getting dressed on any given morning for the past 3 years. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his apartment, holding a tie he hadn't worn since his last performance review at Hargrove & Associates, and felt genuinely ridiculous. "You look weird," said a small voice from the doorway. He glanced over his shoulder. Lily was 6 years old and held her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, by one ear. She was in her pajamas, little blue ones covered in cartoon planets, and she was staring at him with the specific expression she reserved for things she didn't understand but was trying very hard to evaluate. "Thank you," Mason said. "Why are you wearing that?" "Because I'm going to dinner." Lily considered this. "Can I come?" "Not this time, Bug." "Is it a work dinner?" Mason set the tie down on the counter and picked up a regular button-down shirt instead. "No, it's dinner with someone I haven't met yet." Lily's face scrunched. "That's weird." "It is a little weird, yeah." She patted across the bathroom tile and looked at his reflection alongside his in the mirror. She was small enough that only her eyes and the top of her head appeared at the bottom of the frame, rabbit ears sticking up beside her. "What if you don't like them?" "Then I eat my dinner and come home." "What if they don't like you?" Mason looked down at her. "Then I eat my dinner faster and come home." That made Lily smile. That quick, private smile she had that still occasionally stopped him cold, because it looked so much like a photograph of someone else he no longer let himself think about. He ruffled her hair and she ducked away with a noise of protest, clutching Mr. Buttons tighter. His babysitter, a 20-year-old college student named Dana, who lived 2 floors up, arrived at 6:15. Lily had already moved on from her interrogation of Mason's wardrobe and was absorbed in a picture book on the couch. She barely looked up when he kissed the top of her head. "Be good," he said. "I'm always good," Lily said without lifting her eyes. Dana suppressed a grin. Mason grabbed his keys. He'd agreed to this whole thing because of Colin Reeves, who had been his best friend since they were 19 years old and who had, over the past 18 months, been waging a slow, patient campaign to get Mason back into the world. Colin's arguments had evolved over time. In the beginning, it was the soft approach. "You deserve to be happy, man. You can't just close yourself off forever." When that didn't work, he switched to practical logic. Lily needs to see her dad living his life, not just maintaining it. When that failed too, he tried guilt. "Do you know how hard it is watching you eat leftovers alone at 9:30 at night while I'm trying to call you about something else entirely?" None of it had worked. But then, 3 weeks ago, Colin had tried something different. He hadn't argued at all. He had simply said, "I know someone who I think you should meet. She's smart, she's real, she doesn't play games, one dinner, that's all I'm asking." Mason had said no. Colin had waited 4 days and asked again. Mason had said he'd think about it. Colin had waited 3 more days and sent a reservation confirmation to Mason's email with the message, "It's already done. Show up or don't. But I think you should show up." So Mason had told himself he was doing this to get Colin off his back, which was not entirely a lie, even if it also wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was smaller and harder to say out loud, that he was 32 years old and he was tired of feeling like his life had been put on pause at 29, and that some part of him, the part that still remembered what it was like to look forward to things, was curious. He parked 2 blocks from Alderton's because the lot was full and walked in the January cold with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. The restaurant was the kind of place that understood that good lighting was more important than anything else. Low and warm, copper fixtures over dark wood tables, the murmur of other people's conversations creating a sound like a river moving slowly. He'd been here once before, years ago, for a colleague's birthday dinner. It had seemed like a better memory then. He gave his name at the host stand. The young woman checked her tablet, nodded, and said, "Your party is already here, sir. Right this way." He followed her between tables, adjusting the collar of his shirt, running through the small inventory of conversation he'd prepared for the occasion. He was so focused on managing his own nerves that it took him a full 3 seconds after stopping at the table to actually process what he was seeing. Victoria Ellsworth looked up from the menu she'd been studying with the kind of rigid focus people use when they're using an object as an excuse not to look at the room around them. She was dressed in a dark green blouse, hair pulled back, reading glasses she immediately took off when she saw him. And she went completely still in the way a person goes still when their brain encounters something that doesn't fit any available category. Mason felt the floor shift under him. Not metaphorically. His actual body lost equilibrium for a half second, and he put one hand on the back of the empty chair across from her just to have something solid to hold. "Mason," Victoria said. It wasn't a greeting. It was more like a person saying a word out loud to confirm that the word still meant what they thought it meant. "Victoria," he said. The host, reading nothing from the atmosphere that suggested anything was wrong, smiled and said, "I'll send your server right over," and left them alone. Neither of them sat down. "Colin set this up," Mason said. His voice came out more carefully than he intended. "Patricia set this up," Victoria said. She said it the same way he had, fact before emotion, buying time. Patricia Holloway was Victoria's college friend who had been trying to set her up with someone for over a year. Mason didn't know Patricia well. He knew her name, knew she existed, knew she'd been at 2 of the family Christmases back when he and Laurel were still married. Which was the problem. The complete, catastrophic, no-good problem sitting in the center of this table like a third-place setting, neither of them had ordered. Victoria Ellsworth was 49 years old, the founder and CEO of Ellsworth Strategic Partners, a consulting firm that had made her one of the more respected and occasionally feared names in the corporate sector of this city. She had raised one daughter largely alone after her marriage ended when that daughter was 8. She had a reputation for precision and calm, and a specific kind of directness that people who worked for her called demanding, and people who liked her called honest. She was also the mother of Laurel Ellsworth Calloway, which was Mason's ex-wife's maiden name before she'd taken his, and then quietly, surgically, removed it from her life, along with everything else, which made Victoria Ellsworth the mother of the woman who had left Mason and their then 3-year-old daughter without a complete explanation beyond the one that had circled in his head ever since. "I'm not built for this. I thought I was. I'm not." Mason finally pulled out the chair and sat down, because standing at a restaurant table while his internal architecture rearranged itself seemed like the worst option. Victoria sat down across from him at the same moment, and they looked at each other in the candlelight like two people who had just realized they were both reading from completely different scripts for the same scene. "How did they not know?" Mason said. "Colin doesn't know Patricia well. She wouldn't have known to tell him." Victoria set her reading glasses on the table beside her water glass with the same precision she applied to everything. "Patricia knows I was family adjacent to someone named Mason. She doesn't know your last name, and she wouldn't have thought to connect it. Colin knows my situation, but he doesn't know—" Mason stopped. "He doesn't know your name. I don't think I ever mentioned your name specifically." "No, you wouldn't have." That landed a little harder than it had to, and he saw her register it, a brief tightening at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't mean it as an insult," she said. "I know." The server appeared, a young man with good timing and no awareness that he was walking into something, and asked if they'd like to start with drinks. Victoria ordered sparkling water without looking at the menu. Mason ordered the same thing, not because he wanted it, but because making a decision about anything else felt like too much right now. When the server left, the silence returned. "We could leave," Mason said. "We could. But we're already here." Victoria looked at him steadily. She had always had that quality. The ability to hold eye contact without it feeling like a contest, without it feeling warm either, just direct and present and impossible to read. He had found it unsettling when they'd met through Laurel. He found it unsettling now, but differently. 1 hour, she said. We have dinner, we behave like adults, and then we go home and we never mention this to anyone. And we call our respective matchmaking friends tomorrow and explain what happened. And we call them tomorrow and explain calmly that this can never happen again. A pause. Yes. Mason picked up the menu. 1 hour. Victoria picked hers up too. 1 hour. The first 15 minutes were brutal. They ordered food with the excessive attention to detail of two people who were very grateful to have something to read. Victoria asked the server a question about the preparation of the salmon that was more thorough than the question deserved. Mason ordered a steak he didn't particularly want because it was the first thing on the menu that he recognized. When the server was gone again, they were left with each other. "How is Lily?" Victoria asked. It was the right question and also the hardest one, because Lily was the through line, the only thing they unambiguously shared, and talking about her felt both necessary and strange. "She's good. She's 6 now." "I know." Victoria paused. "Laurel sends photos occasionally." Mason hadn't known that. He tried not to let that show. "She's in 1st grade. She likes dinosaurs and she's learning to read." The dinosaur phase started when she was 4. She named them. Victoria caught something in his expression. "Laurel told me. She'd send photos sometimes with the names written on the back. Steggy. Dr. Longneck. Dr. Longneck is still on the shelf, and Mason found himself almost smiling despite himself. She refuses to move him. She was always stubborn. Victoria said it with unmistakable affection, and then seemed to catch herself and become more careful. "I don't say that as a criticism." "I know." And he did know because Lily's stubbornness was one of his favorite things about her, the specific quality that made her herself and not a more manageable version of herself. There was a pause that was slightly different from the ones before it, not quite as sharp. "You're doing well with her," Victoria said, "from what Laurel says." Mason felt something in his chest go careful and taut. "What does Laurel say?" It came out more pointed than he meant it to, and he saw Victoria register the shift. She didn't flinch from it, but she also didn't pretend it wasn't there. "She says Lily talks about you constantly, that you make her breakfast every morning, even when you're running late, that you learned to braid hair from a YouTube tutorial, and you've been practicing on her stuffed animals." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I got pretty good. Lily says my French braids are better than my regular braids. That's something to be proud of." It took a lot of failed attempts on a rabbit named Mr. Buttons. Victoria's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the kind of movement people make when something catches them off guard enough that their face reacts before their mind catches up. She covered it by reaching for her water glass. The food arrived. They ate. And somewhere in the mechanics of that, the physical act of having something to do with their hands, the small practical conversations about whether the bread was good, it was, and whether the lighting was making it hard to see the menu clearly, it was, the hour stopped feeling like a timer counting down and started feeling more like time passing at its normal speed. Mason had told himself he wouldn't ask. He had told himself this very specifically on the walk from his car, and again while he'd been reading the menu. He had composed and discarded the question approximately 4 times during the meal. By the time dessert menus appeared, which neither of them ordered, but which gave them a reason to keep sitting, he had run out of other things to say. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria set down her fork. "You can ask." "During the marriage." He stopped, recalibrated. "When Laurel and I were married, you were always..." He tried to find the right word. "You were always correct with me, polite. But it never felt like you actually approved of you." That's one way to say it. She was quiet for a long moment, not stalling, thinking, which was different. He'd noticed that about her early on. She didn't fill silence the way some people did. She let it exist until she had something real to put in it. "You were attentive," she said finally. "You were present. You clearly loved my daughter, and you were wonderful with Lily when she was born." A pause. "Those were all things I could see. I could also see that Laurel was..." She paused again, more carefully this time. Laurel has always struggled to stay in the things that matter to her. Not because she doesn't feel them. She does. But there's something in her that becomes frightened by permanence, by love when it becomes too real, too requiring. She's always found reasons to leave before she could be left. Mason set down his own fork. That's not a new pattern, Victoria said. It started when she was young. Friendships, activities, places she loved. She would pour herself into them completely, and then, at a certain point, she would begin to find the flaws. And once she found the flaws, she would start to leave. She looked at him steadily. I watched her do that with you. I could see it happening. I could not stop it. And I didn't want to become attached to someone she was going to leave, because I knew what that would cost me. The honesty of it was almost difficult to sit with. Mason had spent 3 years constructing careful theories about what he had done wrong, what had been insufficient or flawed, or simply not enough about him to make Laurel stay. He had examined those theories from every angle in the privacy of nights after Lily was asleep. He had arrived at no satisfying conclusion because he had never stopped to consider that the conclusion might not be about him at all. You didn't think it was my fault, he said. I never thought it was your fault. You could have said something. What would I have said? My daughter has a pattern, and you're likely to become part of it. I'm sorry in advance. She shook her head, and I was not certain. I hoped I was wrong. There were times when I believed I was wrong. She looked out the window briefly, then back. I was not wrong. Mason was quiet for a while. The restaurant hummed around them. He watched the candle between them burn and felt something he didn't have an immediate name for moving through him. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. The particular sensation of a weight being renamed, not removed, just reclassified from personal failure to something more complicated, more human. She never said that to me, he said. Laurel, she never explained it that way. I don't think she has that language yet. Victoria said it without judgment. She may someday. Does she? He stopped. Does she ever ask about Lily? To you, I mean. Victoria's expression changed in a way that was harder to read. Sometimes, she doesn't ask in depth. She asks enough to know Lily as well, and then she doesn't ask more. Right, he exhaled. Right. I want you to know, Victoria said, with a careful precision that told him she'd been weighing whether to say this, that I am sorry, for my own distance. That wasn't fair to you. You were trying to build something real, and I made it harder by treating you like someone who was already leaving. Mason looked at her across the table. This woman he had known as a peripheral presence in the life he used to have, who had always seemed to exist slightly behind glass, composed and unreachable, and somehow already disappointed. She looked different right now. Not less composed, but the composure seemed like something she wore rather than something she was made of. Thank you for telling me, he said. Honestly, I figured we were past the point of performing. One uncomfortable conversation minimum, he said. She almost smiled. We've already had it. Might as well say the true things. It was 9:40 by the time they were standing on the sidewalk outside Alderton's, and the 1-hour agreement had expanded without either of them explicitly acknowledging it into something closer to 2.5. The January air was cold and clean. Mason's breath made small clouds. Victoria had her coat belted and stood with the particular upright stillness of a person who has learned to take up exactly the space they intend and no more. I will call Patricia tomorrow, she said. I'll call Colin. This was... She paused. It was not what I expected. No, Mason agreed. It definitely was not. They stood there for a moment in the way two people stand when a conversation has reached its natural end, but neither party has moved yet. Across the street, a couple emerged from another restaurant laughing about something, their voices bright in the night air. Your daughter has good taste in dinosaurs, Victoria said. Mason laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. I'll tell her you said so, though I won't explain how I know. Probably wise. She raised a hand in a small, precise gesture that wasn't quite a wave and wasn't quite nothing, acknowledgement, maybe, of something that didn't have a category yet, and turned and walked toward the parking structure at the end of the block. Her heels were quiet on the pavement, and the city folded her into its evening noise within a minute. Mason stood for a moment longer in the cold. He had walked in expecting a stranger. He had not gotten a stranger. He had gotten something far more confusing and harder to categorize, sitting in a restaurant where the lighting was warm and the bread was good, telling him things he had needed to hear for 3 years from the last person on earth he would have thought to ask. He thought about Lily waiting at home with Mr. Buttons and Dana, and probably still awake because she always tried to outlast the babysitter and rarely succeeded. He thought about the French braids he'd been practicing in the dinosaur shelf and the Wednesday morning ritual of blueberry pancakes that he'd started because Lily had mentioned once, in passing, that they were her favorite. He thought about the particular weight he'd carried since the divorce. Not grief exactly, more like the slow accumulation of questions without answers, of wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with his own judgment that he hadn't been able to see what was coming. He thought about Victoria Ellsworth saying quietly, "I never thought it was your fault." He pulled his jacket tighter and walked back to his car. He had no idea what to do with any of this. That was fine. That was honest. He didn't need to know what to do with it tonight. He just needed to drive home and pay Dana and look in on Lily sleeping and go to bed and wake up tomorrow and make pancakes. That was enough. That was what there was. He got in the car, started it, and sat for a moment while the heat came up. His phone buzzed. Colin. How'd it go? Mason stared at the message for a long moment. He typed, "We need to talk tomorrow. I'm fine. Nothing bad happened. But we need to talk." He set the phone on the passenger seat and pulled out of the parking structure into the quiet January street. Tomorrow he would explain. Tonight he would drive home to his daughter, and he would try to figure out which parts of himself had shifted slightly tonight, and which parts had simply been held up to a different kind of light and shown as something other than what he'd assumed. He turned onto Broadmoor and accelerated gently, the city sliding past on either side, amber and quiet and indifferent in the best possible way. 3 miles to home. He kept driving. He called Colin the next morning at 7:43, before Lily was fully awake and while the coffee was still brewing, which meant he was running on 0 caffeine and whatever unprocessed residue the previous night had left in him. Colin picked up on the second ring. "Okay, your text scared me a little. What happened? Did she stand you up? Was she terrible? Was she married?" "None of those things." "Then what? You said nothing bad happened, which is the most alarming way to open a sentence." Mason leaned against the kitchen counter and watched the coffee drip. "Her name was Victoria Ellsworth." Silence. "Colin. I'm here. I'm just—" A long pause. "Mason, I didn't know. I swear to you I had no idea. Patricia just said she had a friend, a woman, smart, accomplished, ready to actually date someone instead of just thinking about it. I know you didn't know. I would never— obviously I would never. Colin. I know." Mason exhaled. "That's not why I'm calling." Another pause, this one more careful. "Okay, why are you calling?" The coffee finished. Mason poured a cup and stood there holding it. Through the hall, he could hear Lily starting to move around. The thump of small feet on hardwood, the sound of Mr. Buttons being dragged somewhere. "We stayed," he said. "Almost 3 hours." Colin was very quiet. "It was, strange and hard. But we talked, really talked." Mason set the coffee down. "She told me things about Laurel that I never knew, that I needed to know 3 years ago and nobody told me." "What kind of things?" "The kind that change how you understand everything that happened." He didn't explain more than that. Some of it wasn't his to share, and some of it was still too new and tender to put into words without the words feeling insufficient. Colin, to his credit, didn't push. He asked only whether Mason was okay. Mason said he thought so. Colin said he was going to call Patricia and have a long conversation. Mason said that seemed reasonable. They hung up. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her planet pajamas with her hair in catastrophic disarray and Mr. Buttons tucked under one arm. "You're up early," she announced. "So are you." "I smelled coffee." She regarded the mug in his hand with mild suspicion. "Can I have some?" "Absolutely not." "I know." She climbed onto her stool at the kitchen island without being asked. "Can I have the cereal with the little stars?" "Yeah, Bug." He reached for the cabinet. "Yeah, you can have the stars." The thing about having a 6-year-old was that life didn't allow you much time to disappear into your own head. There were lunches to pack and permission slips to find and Tuesday morning arguments about whether it was cold enough for a coat. It always was in January. And homework folders that needed signing and bath routines that ran long because Lily had discovered that creating small soap sculptures was more interesting than getting clean. The ordinary machinery of their life together ran constantly, and it demanded his attention in a way that was both exhausting and, if he was honest, something like a mercy. He thought about the conversation with Victoria in the available margins, on the drive to Lily's school, in the elevator at Hargrove and Associates, during the 18 minutes between when he put Lily to bed and when he stopped being able to hold his eyes open. He turned the things she'd said over like objects he was examining for weight and dimension. I never thought it was your fault, trying to figure out where to put them in the architecture of how he understood his own history. The problem was that he'd built a lot of that architecture on the assumption that the failure was primarily his. Not entirely. He wasn't that hard on himself, but substantially. He had loved Laurel, and she had left, and in the absence of a complete explanation, he had defaulted to the quiet, persistent belief that he had been somehow not enough. Not enough presence, not enough understanding, not enough capacity for whatever it was she had needed that he hadn't known how to give. Having that framework dismantled was not, it turned out, an immediately comfortable experience. It was more disorienting than relieving. Because if the story he'd been telling himself was wrong, then 3 years of organizing his understanding of himself around that story was also wrong, which meant he had to go back and look at everything again and figure out what was actually true. That was a lot of work. It was the kind of work that didn't come with a visible endpoint. He was in the middle of exactly this kind of thinking on Thursday afternoon, sitting at his desk at Hargrove with a contract review open in front of him that he'd been staring at for 20 minutes without reading, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a text appeared. "This is Victoria Ellsworth. I got your number from Patricia, who got it from Colin. I apologize for the unannounced contact. I wanted to make sure you were all right after the other night. You can ignore this if you prefer." Mason stared at the message for a while. He typed back, "I'm all right. Are you?" A pause. Then, "I've been thinking about the conversation. I wanted to make sure I didn't say anything that made things worse rather than better." "You didn't," he wrote. Then, after a moment, "You said things I actually needed to hear, even if I'm still figuring out what to do with them." Another pause, longer this time. "That's fair. These things take time to settle." He looked at the message, then at the contract still open on his screen, then back at the message. "Can I ask you something?" he typed. "You can ask." She'd said that at the restaurant too, the same phrasing. He filed that away without meaning to. "When you said Laurel had a pattern, do you think she knows? About herself, I mean." The reply took nearly 2 minutes. He watched the screen. "I think she knows something is wrong. I think she doesn't know what to call it yet. She's not a bad person, Mason. I want you to understand that I've never thought she was a bad person. She's someone who is frightened in a very specific way and hasn't learned yet how to stay inside that fear instead of running from it." He read it twice. "I know she's not a bad person," he wrote back. "She's Lily's mother. I've never let myself think of her as a bad person. I know. That's something I respect about you." He didn't know what to do with that. He set his phone face down on the desk and went back to the contract, and this time he actually read it. They texted sporadically over the following 2 weeks, not frequently, 3 or 4 exchanges, each one slightly longer than the last, each one circling the same general territory of honesty that the dinner had opened up. She asked about Lily once, and he told her about the incident with the class hamster that Lily had been appointed to care for over a long weekend, a story that involved a near escape, a very stressful 40 minutes, and a hamster eventually found sleeping inside a winter boot. And Victoria sent back a response that was 7 words long. "That child will be a remarkable adult." He laughed at his phone in the parking lot of a grocery store and felt briefly insane about that. She mentioned, in passing, a difficult board meeting she was preparing for. He asked what made it difficult. She told him more than he expected. Not the details, but the shape of it. The particular exhaustion of being the decision maker in a room where every decision comes with a consequence someone will pay for. Does it get easier, he asked, making calls like that? No, she wrote. You just get better at not second-guessing yourself afterward, which isn't the same thing. He thought about that for days. 3 weeks after the dinner, Colin called to inform Mason, with the specific gleeful energy of someone who had been waiting to deliver a piece of information, that Patricia had told him Victoria had mentioned the dinner conversation to her and described it as unexpectedly worthwhile. Colin said this as though it were a revelation. Mason said, okay, and changed the subject to football, which Colin took as confirmation that something was happening that Mason wasn't ready to discuss. That was fair. Mason wasn't ready to discuss it because he didn't know what to discuss. He knew that he thought about Victoria Ellsworth more than the situation logically called for. He knew that their text conversations had a quality he found difficult to name. Not easy exactly, but real, in the way that very few of his conversations were real anymore. Because most of his conversations were either professional or logistical or involved a 6-year-old who wanted to talk exclusively about prehistoric animals. He knew that when he thought about calling it off, just stopping the contact, letting it fade back to nothing, something in him pushed back against the idea with more force than seemed proportionate. What he didn't know was what any of that meant, or what it was supposed to do with the fact that this woman was his ex-wife's mother, which was a sentence that sounded like the premise of something deeply problematic, regardless of how the actual situation felt from the inside. He was still sitting with all of this when, 4 weeks after the dinner, she called. He was putting Lily to bed, which meant the call went unanswered, and he called back at 9:15 when the apartment was quiet. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Sorry, Lily's bedtime runs long, he said. Don't apologize. I remember what bedtimes were like. He settled onto his couch with his feet on the coffee table. You called instead of texting. I did. Something specific? A pause. I wanted to ask if you'd like to have coffee. Not... She stopped. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting anything beyond coffee. I'm asking because our conversations have been... I find them valuable. And I thought a real conversation might be more useful than texts. He was quiet for a moment. I think that's an honest way to ask. I try to be honest. It's sometimes socially inconvenient. Saturday morning, he said. There's a place near my building that's good. Decent coffee, and they don't play music loud enough to make conversation difficult. That sounds fine. That I can text you the address. Yes. A pause. Thank you, Mason. For what? For not making this strange. He almost said it's already a little strange, but what he actually said was, Saturday, 10 o'clock. What? The coffee shop was called Meridian, and it smelled like roasted beans and old wood and the particular comfortable warmth of a place that had been operating long enough to have a character. He got there first and took a corner table with good sight lines to the door, which was a habit he'd developed without noticing it. The single-parent instinct to always be able to see the exit. Victoria arrived at 3 minutes past 10, which felt like deliberately not arriving on the dot, and he appreciated that. She was in a dark coat, a cream-colored scarf, less formal than the restaurant, or formal in a different, more personal register. She spotted him immediately and crossed the room without hesitation. Good place, she said, sitting down and looking around. I've been coming here on weekends since Lily started sleeping past 6. It's become a personal ritual. What time does she wake up now? Usually around 7, sometimes 7:30 if I'm lucky. The server came. Victoria ordered a black coffee. Mason ordered the same thing, which he noticed afterward and considered whether it meant anything and decided it didn't. How is the board situation? He asked. He'd been thinking about what she'd told him. She looked slightly surprised. It concluded. Better than expected, actually. She wrapped her hands around the mug the server set in front of her. I made a decision that 2 of my board members disagreed with strongly. They registered their disagreement formally. We had a difficult 3-hour meeting. And the decision stood, because it was the right decision, and I had the documentation to prove it. A pause. They weren't wrong to push back. That's part of the system functioning correctly, but the decision was right. What was it about? She looked at him for a moment as though deciding how specific to be. I terminated a contract with a partner firm that had been with Ellsworth Strategic for 11 years. Profitable relationship by the numbers. But the firm had been making internal decisions that I found ethically borderline. Not illegal, just borderline. She looked at her coffee. 2 board members felt the numbers outweighed the ethics concerns. I disagreed. How long did it take you to make the call? About 4 minutes. He raised an eyebrow. 4 minutes for an 11-year relationship. The decision was clear. The difficulty was the consequence, not the choice. She met his eye. There's a difference between a hard decision and a complicated one. That was hard. It wasn't complicated. Mason turned that over. At Hargrove, he handled commercial contracts, construction, real estate, the heavy machinery of deals that moved money and materials, and occasionally careers. The decisions in his world were often both hard and complicated, and he'd spent years conflating the two. The idea of separating them was practical in a way that felt immediately applicable. I've been using those interchangeably, he said. Most people do. It makes them slower than they need to be. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He couldn't have told you afterward exactly how long each subject lasted, or the precise sequence in which they moved from one to the next. It wasn't that kind of conversation. It moved the way good conversations do, without visible seams following whatever thread was most alive at any given moment. She asked about his work and actually listened to the answer, which sounds like a low bar but is in practice something that roughly 40% of people fail. He asked about Ellsworth Strategic's founding, which had been 11 years ago, and she told him the version that wasn't the polished presentation deck version, the version with the wrong decisions and the client she lost in year 2 that had kept her up for 6 weeks, and the business partner she'd started with who had left after 18 months and taken a chunk of the early accounts with them. "Did you sue?" he asked. "I considered it. I was talked out of it by a lawyer friend who told me the cost in time and focus would exceed whatever I recovered." A pause. He was right. I still think about it occasionally. The money or the principle? She considered. The principle. The money I made back. The principle still bothers me. I trusted someone and they used that trust to damage something I'd built. That doesn't stop bothering you just because the damage is repaired. He knew that particular feeling exactly. He didn't say so, but she seemed to read something in his expression because she said, "I'm not comparing it to your situation. I know those aren't the same thing." "They're not completely different either," he said. And then, because she'd been honest with him, and that tended to make him honest back, the damage being repaired and the thing still bothering you. That's a reasonably accurate description of where I am. The practical damage is repaired. I have Lily, I have my work, I have a life that functions, but he tried to find the word. The underlying sense that I missed something I should have seen coming, that part hasn't fully gone. She nodded slowly. That part takes longer, and it may never go completely, but it does change in character. Does it change for the better? It becomes less about the failure and more about the education, she paused. Whether that's better depends on the day. He laughed, a real one, slightly rueful. That's not very encouraging. I'm not particularly in the business of false encouragement. No, he said. I noticed that. She smiled then, a real one, which he'd only seen once before, and it changed her face in a way that he registered with the careful, cautious part of himself that had been keeping notes this whole time without his permission. He looked away first, at the window, at the street outside where people moved through the late morning with their coats and their coffee cups and their own private waits. When he looked back, she was also looking at the window, and there was something in the set of her jaw that was not composure so much as the effort of maintaining it. "Victoria," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad we stayed, that night. I'm glad neither of us left." She was quiet for a moment. "So am I," she said, though I reserve the right to find that somewhat alarming. Alarming seems fair. It's a complicated situation. Hard, he said, not complicated. She looked at him for a beat. "Don't use my own framework against me, Mason." "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she picked up her coffee, and the conversation moved forward. And outside the window, the January morning went on in its ordinary way. indifferent to the two of them sitting in the corner and slowly, carefully, without either of them having agreed to it, learning each other. He drove home with the windows slightly down despite the cold, which was a thing he sometimes did when he needed to feel awake and present in his own skin. Lily had been with Dana for the morning, and he was picking her up on his way back. She would want to tell him everything that had happened in the past 2 hours, in the detailed, non-linear way she told stories, and he would listen to every word of it. But for the 11 minutes between Meridian and his building, he sat with the quiet. He thought about the way Victoria had said, "I find them valuable" when she called. The careful precision of that. Not "I've been enjoying our conversations" or "I like talking to you." "I find them valuable." As though she'd evaluated the cost and the return and concluded that the investment was justified, which was probably the truest thing she could have said, and also the most honest, and also somehow the most unexpectedly moving, because he understood that for a person like Victoria Ellsworth, that calculation was not a small thing. He pulled into the parking structure and sat in the car for 30 seconds after he turned off the engine. He did not know where this was going. He did not know if it was going anywhere at all, or whether the shape of what they were to each other had any recognizable name, or whether naming it was even the right move at this stage, or what this stage even meant given the particular geometry of their history. What he knew was that he was not willing to stop it. Not today. Not without a better reason than the one he'd been carrying around, which was only fear. The ordinary, unheroic fear of a man who had already been hurt and didn't particularly want to be hurt again. That was a reason to be careful. It was not a reason to walk away. He got out of the car, took the elevator up, knocked on Dana's door, and listened to Lily come running down the hall at the sound of his knock, already beginning a story at full volume before the door was even open. He caught her when she launched herself at him, all elbows and rabbit and chaos, and held on. The Saturday coffees became a pattern without either of them officially making it one. There was no conversation where they agreed to meet weekly. It simply happened. One Saturday, then the following one, then the one after that, until Meridian became a standing arrangement that neither of them acknowledged out loud because acknowledging it would have required naming what it was, and they were both, in their separate ways, not ready for that particular conversation. They were careful with each other. That was the most accurate word for it. Not cold, not distant, careful, the way you are with something that matters and that you don't fully understand yet, the way you handle an object before you know its weight. They talked about work. They talked about Lily. Victoria always asked, and her questions were specific in a way that told him she'd been retaining the details, which he noticed and didn't know what to do with. They talked about the city, about bad decisions they'd each made in their 30s, about books Victoria had read and hadn't, and the specific reasons she abandoned a book when she did. Mason told her about growing up in Dayton, Ohio, the younger of 2 brothers, a father who worked in manufacturing, and a mother who had strong opinions about the importance of finishing what you started. Victoria told him about growing up in a narrow house in Connecticut with a grandmother who believed that women who showed uncertainty in public were embarrassing themselves. He asked how that had shaped her. She said, "In ways I'm still identifying." He started texting her things that weren't questions, which was different from how it had started. Small things. A photograph Lily drew that he found on the refrigerator one morning, a purple dinosaur standing next to a tall woman in a green dress, labeled in 6-year-old handwriting as Dr. Longneck and Miss Vicky, which he stared at for 30 seconds before realizing Lily must have heard him mention Victoria's name at some point and filed it away in the specific, unsettling way children file things away. He sent it without explanation. Victoria responded, "She gave me a dress. That's more consideration than most people show." He wrote back, "You've made an impression on a child who has never met you." A pause. "I'm not sure what to do with that information." She replied, "Neither am I." That exchange sat with him for days. He was aware, in the way you are aware of something you are choosing not to look at directly, that the situation had moved past coffee between 2 people who happened to share a complicated history. He knew it the same way he knew when a contract had a hidden clause that would matter later. Not because he could point to the specific language, but because he'd been doing this long enough to recognize the shape of something. He just hadn't figured out what he was supposed to do about it. The answer, as it turned out, was taken partially out of his hands in the second week of March, by a situation that had nothing to do with either of them personally and everything to do with the world they both occupied professionally. Well, Mason had been working on the Hartwell account for 7 months. Hartwell Development Group was a mid-sized commercial real estate firm that Hargrove and Associates had brought on as a client through a partner named Richard Oakes, who was the kind of lawyer who played golf with the right people and made decisions based on relationships rather than documentation. The Hartwell deal involved a series of acquisition contracts for 3 commercial properties across the city, and Mason had been the primary drafter on all of them. The problem emerged on a Tuesday. A junior associate named Priya pulled him aside at 2 in the afternoon with an expression he recognized as the expression of someone who has found something they wish they hadn't found. "The Hartwell Amendment from November," she said, keeping her voice down in the hallway. "The one that modified the liability clause on the second property. What about it?" "Oakes signed off on it, but the modification wasn't flagged to the client as a material change. I was pulling everything together for the closing file and She stopped. "It's not compliant with the disclosure requirements we outlined in the original engagement letter." Mason stood very still. "Show me." He spent the next 3 hours in his office reading documents he had already read, looking at them from the angle Priya had identified, and arriving with a growing cold clarity at the conclusion that she was right. The amendment wasn't fraudulent. It wasn't, by the most technical definition, illegal. But it was the kind of oversight that regulators and opposing counsel, and more immediately clients, could interpret very badly if it surfaced at the wrong moment, and closings had a way of surfacing everything. The worst problem was Richard Oakes, who had signed off on the amendment and who was a senior partner and who had, Mason suspected, approved the modification knowing the disclosure issue existed and deciding that the relationship with Hartwell's principals was sufficient insurance. That was a judgment call that Oakes had made. Mason had not been in that decision, but Mason's name was on the underlying documents, and in the accounting of how these things went sideways, the person whose name was on the paper often paid a share of the price, regardless of who had made the call. He called Priya back in and told her to document what she'd found precisely and not to discuss it with anyone yet. He told her she'd done the right thing. He could see she was frightened, and he understood that. She was 26 years old, and this was her 3rd year at the firm, and she'd just uncovered something that could potentially embarrass a senior partner. He tried to say enough to reassure her without promising her anything he wasn't certain of. After she left, he sat at his desk and stared at the window for a while. His phone was on the desk. He reached for it twice and put it back down. On the 3rd reach, he picked it up and typed, "Are you available to talk tonight? Not urgent, but I could use a perspective from someone who's made decisions like this." Victoria replied in 11 minutes. "I'm available at 8. Call me." He called at 8:04 after Lily was in bed and the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet. He explained the situation in the measured, precise way he explained professional problems, laying out the facts before the implications, the document before the context. She listened without interrupting. He had noticed this about her before. The way she listened with her whole attention, not waiting for her turn but actually tracking, holding the shape of what he was telling her. When he finished, she said, "Who else knows at the firm?" "Priya and me." "Oakes knows what he approved. He may or may not know you found it." "I don't think he does yet." "What's your instinct about what he'll do if you bring it to him?" Mason considered. "He'll manage it. He'll find a way to reframe the disclosure issue as minor and move to close before anyone looks too hard. And if closing happens and the issue surfaces later, the liability flows to whoever signed the documents. Meaning you. Among others, but yes." A pause. "What does your firm's ethics policy say about this kind of disclosure gap?" "That it needs to be self-reported to the managing partner before closing." "Then you know what you have to do." "I know," he said. "I'm not calling you to be talked out of it. I'm calling because—" He stopped. "Because this is going to be a difficult conversation with a senior partner who has a lot more history at this firm than I do, and I wanted to think it through with someone who's been in rooms like that." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Oakes will not like being reported. He'll frame it as disloyalty. He may make it expensive for you within the firm." "I know that too. But if you don't report it and it surfaces at closing or afterward, the cost is higher. And it won't just be financial. You know it's wrong to let it go through without disclosure. That's not a regulatory opinion. That's a moral one." "Yeah." Then you already know this conversation isn't actually about strategy. He exhaled slowly. No, it's not. Do you want me to tell you it will be fine? No. Good, because I don't know if it will. What I know is that you'll be able to live with the decision. That's not nothing. A pause. It's actually most of what you have. He sat with that for a moment. Outside his window, the city made its nighttime sounds. A car somewhere, a distant siren, the ambient hum of the building itself. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet. Go have the conversation with your managing partner first. He had it the next morning. It lasted 40 minutes. The managing partner, a woman named Claire Hsu, who had been running the firm for 6 years with the specific combination of practicality and principle that Mason had always respected, listened to everything he said. She asked 6 questions. She called Oakes in that afternoon. Mason was not in that meeting. He didn't know exactly what happened in it. What he knew was that by Thursday morning, the Hartwell closing had been pushed by 3 weeks, the disclosure issue had been formally flagged to the client, and Richard Oakes was walking the hallways with the particular compressed expression of a man who has lost an argument he expected to win. Priya stopped by his office Friday afternoon. I heard Oakes is telling people you went over his head to protect yourself. I know. Is that going to be a problem? Mason looked at the stack of files on his desk. Probably for a while, yeah. For what it's worth, she said, I think you did the right thing. Yeah. He leaned back in his chair. So do I. That doesn't make it not a problem. She nodded and left. He picked up his phone and sent Victoria a text. It's done. It went the way I expected. Thank you for Tuesday night. She wrote back, How are you? He thought about it honestly. Tired. But okay. Come to coffee tomorrow. You can tell me how it actually went. He typed, You just said you'd know how it actually went. I said I expected Tuesday. I want to hear Saturday. He put the phone down and almost smiled despite the fatigue and the residual tension that had been living in his shoulders all week. The particular feeling of being actually known by another person, not managed or handled or kept at a professional arm's length, but known, the real unpolished version, was something he had forgotten could exist in a conversation that wasn't with a 6-year-old. Saturday at Meridian, she arrived first for the first time. He saw her through the window as he approached, already at their corner table, coat folded over the back of her chair, reading something on her phone. She looked up when he pushed through the door, and the something in her expression when she saw him, a very small softening, a fraction of relief, landed on him in a way he felt in his chest before he'd finished walking across the room. He sat down. The server brought coffee without being asked, which meant they'd become regulars in a way that had earned them that small recognition. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. The 40-minute meeting with Claire, the pushed closing, Oakes in the hallway, Priya's report of what was being said. He told her without editing it, which was not how he usually told professional stories. Usually he organized them first, trimmed the ragged edges, presented the version that was coherent. With Victoria, he'd stopped doing that somewhere around their 3rd Saturday, and he wasn't entirely sure when it had happened. She listened. When he finished, she said, Oakes will get over it or he won't. Either way, you'll know which kind of firm you're actually working at. That's a cold comfort. It's still a comfort. She wrapped her hands around her mug. For what it's worth, and I recognize I'm not a neutral party here, what you did required something. Reporting a senior partner on a compliance issue when your name is also on the documents is not the self-protective move. It's the right move, and those are different things. You'd have done the same thing. She paused. Yes, but I'm the person who terminated a profitable 11-year contract over ethics concerns. My tolerance for short-term cost in exchange for doing things correctly is perhaps above average. Perhaps, he said dryly. She looked at him over her coffee cup. I told my board about the contract termination the same day I made the decision, before I had the documentation fully assembled. 2 of them thought I was moving too fast. A pause. I was not moving too fast, but I understood their concern, and I said so, and then I told them the decision was made and I would prepare the documentation for their files. Did they push back? Formally, which was their right. She set down the mug. I've never believed that doing the right thing should require the other people in the room to agree with you first. It's good when they do. It's not a prerequisite. Mason looked at her. This woman across a corner table in a coffee shop that smelled like roasted beans and warm wood, who said things with the unadorned precision of someone who had thought them through completely before letting them out of her mouth. There was a discomfort in the look he gave her because he was aware of what was happening in him, and he was also aware that it was not a simple or straightforward thing, and that being aware of it didn't tell him what to do about it. She read something in his expression. He could tell because she went slightly still, the particular stillness he'd learned to recognize as her paying attention to something beyond the words. "Mason?" "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I know what this is starting to look like." He set his own mug down. "I've known for a while." "So have I." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out whether I should say something or whether it was better to leave it alone." "What stopped you from saying something?" She looked at him directly. "The obvious complication, and the fact that I'm 19 years older than you, which I suspect matters less to you than it does to me, but it's there." "It's there," he agreed. "It doesn't change what this is." "No." Her voice was careful. "But it changes what it requires to do correctly." Another pause. "And there's Laurel." "Laurel is not in my life. She's in Lily's life, peripherally, and I'm her mother." She didn't say it as an argument, more as a fact being named so neither of them had to pretend it wasn't in the room. "Whatever this is, it has consequences that extend beyond us." "I know that. I'm not saying no." She said it quickly, which told him she understood how that was landing. "I'm saying that if we're going to be honest with each other, which has apparently become our default mode, then we have to be honest about what the complications are." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a Saturday crowd moved along the sidewalk, unhurried. Someone walked past with a dog on a leash, and a child on the other side, and the child was saying something animated, and the parent was nodding with the expression of a person who has heard this particular subject discussed at length and is content to hear it again. "One question," Mason said. "All right. If the complication weren't there, the history, Laurel, the age, all of it, what would you want?" Victoria held his gaze. She didn't answer immediately, which he had stopped interpreting as hesitation and started interpreting as the care she took with true things. "I would want this," she said quietly. "What we already have, and more of it." He nodded slowly. "But the complications are there," she said. "They are." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not asking you to pretend they aren't. I'm asking you to not let them be the only thing that matters." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face, not softening exactly, but shifting, adjusting to a new internal configuration. He recognized it because he'd felt the same thing happening in himself for weeks without having language for it until this moment. "That's a reasonable ask," she said finally. "I thought so." "Don't look smug about it." "I'm not looking smug." "You're almost looking smug." He picked up his coffee to hide whatever his face was doing. She did the same. Around them, Meridian hummed with its ordinary Saturday life. Conversations, the sound of the espresso machine, a child at a table near the window, carefully eating a muffin with both hands. They sat there a while longer, not resolving anything, not naming anything, but not leaving it unnamed in quite the same way as before. The light through the window was pale and clean, and it fell on the table between them and made everything look slightly more defined than usual, and neither of them looked away from it. When they finally stood to leave, Victoria picked up her coat, and as she turned toward the door, she paused with her back half turned to him and said, without looking, "For what it's worth, Mason, what you did at the firm this week, the way you handled it." A pause. "I noticed." She walked toward the door. He stood at the table for a beat longer, holding that before he followed. The word noticed stayed with him for longer than it had any right to. He turned it over on the drive home from Meridian, and again that night after Lily was in bed, and twice more during the following week in the quiet moments between contracts and client calls when his mind went looking for something to hold. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was one word from a woman who measured her words with the precision of someone who understood that language had consequences, and she had chosen that one. He didn't text her about it. He didn't bring it up the following Saturday, but he held it the way you hold something small and dense that you know has more weight than its size suggests. What changed in the weeks after that conversation was something structural rather than dramatic. The careful distance they'd maintained, the unspoken agreement to stay on the side of the line where things were still technically undefined, quietly rearranged itself into something more honest. They stopped pretending the Saturday coffees were casual. They stopped performing the slight formality they'd both been using as a buffer. When he texted her something that made her laugh, she didn't laugh easily. But when something caught her off guard, the response came quickly and without her usual precision. He stopped pretending he didn't notice the specific satisfaction that produced in him. She called him one Tuesday evening in mid-April, and they talked for an hour and 20 minutes about nothing critical. Work things. Lily things. A news story Victoria had strong opinions about. A terrible structural metaphor Mason had used in a brief that his supervising partner had circled in red ink and left on his desk without comment. She laughed at that one. A real laugh, not the controlled near smile he'd catalogued from the early weeks. And he sat on his couch with his feet on the coffee table and felt the particular lightness of being found genuinely funny by someone you respect. After they hung up, he sat in the quiet for a while and admitted to himself, without dramatics, that he was in it. Whatever it was. He was in it, and he was not interested in getting out of it, and the complications that Victoria had named at Meridian were real and present, and not shrinking. And he was in it anyway. The complications had names. They had always had names. He just hadn't been ready to call them by those names until now. The first name was Laurel. Not Laurel herself. She wasn't present in his daily life in any way that required navigation. She called on Lily's birthday, and at Christmas, brief calls that Lily handled with the resilient matter-of-factness of a child who had grown up with a particular shape of family and accepted it as the only shape she knew. Mason handled those calls by leaving the room and finding something to do in the kitchen, which was not a healthy coping mechanism, but was the one he had. The complication wasn't Laurel. It was the idea of Laurel, the symbolic weight of the fact that Victoria was her mother, that any relationship between Mason and Victoria would exist in a web of connection that Laurel was also part of, whether she participated or not. He thought about what it would look like if Victoria became a presence in Lily's life, a more present one, a named one, and what Laurel would make of that, whether it would be something she could accept or something that would damage whatever fragile functional distance currently existed in their arrangement. He brought it up on a Wednesday evening in late April, when Victoria was at his apartment for the first time. She'd come to return a book she'd borrowed. He'd lent her a novel he'd recommended 3 Saturdays ago, a thing that had happened so naturally that he only recognized afterward it as a threshold being crossed, and she'd arrived at 6:30 and Lily had still been awake. He'd expected to feel the anxiety of compartments colliding, but Lily had looked at Victoria with the frank assessment of a first grader who has strong opinions about adults and said, "Are you the Miss Vicky from my drawing?" And Victoria had said yes without missing a beat, and Lily had said, "I gave you a green dress because green is the best color." And Victoria had said, "I happen to agree with that completely." And Lily had decided that this was sufficient and gone back to her dinosaur arrangement on the living room floor as though the entire interaction had been entirely expected. Mason had watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and something complicated happening in his chest. Lily was in bed by 8. Mason made coffee he didn't really need, and they sat at his kitchen table, which was a different kind of sitting together than the coffee shop. More interior, more exposed somehow, the specific vulnerability of being in someone's actual life rather than a neutral meeting place. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right. Laurel." He set down his mug. "Have you talked to her since the dinner?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Twice. Our usual calls. I didn't mention the dinner. Does she know we've been... whatever this is?" "No." A pause. "I've thought about whether to tell her." "What have you decided?" "That I don't know yet." She held his gaze. "Laurel and I have a complicated relationship. We love each other in the way that families who have been through things love each other, with a lot underneath that doesn't get fully said. She is not someone who confides easily in me, and I am not someone she comes to for support in the conventional sense." Another pause. She would have opinions about this. Negative ones. Almost certainly at first. Whether they would remain negative, I genuinely don't know. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. She doesn't have a claim on your life, Mason. I want to be clear about that. She chose to leave. You've built 3 years here without her being part of it. She doesn't get to decide what you do with that. I know. That's not what I'm worried about. What are you worried about? He considered how to say it. Lily, if Laurel reacts badly, if she decides to become less cooperative about the arrangement because of this, it's Lily who pays for that. I've kept the parallel tracks separate very carefully for 3 years, specifically because disrupting the arrangement disrupts Lily. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful but unguarded. That's a legitimate concern. You're right to name it. She looked at him directly. I can't promise you how Laurel will react. I know my daughter, but I don't control her responses. A pause. What I can tell you is that I have no intention of conducting this, whatever this is, in a way that could be used as a weapon against Lily's stability. If it came to that, I would not allow it. And if Laurel decided to push back, through channels, then I would speak to Laurel directly, not to manage her, to be honest with her about what's happening and what she's entitled to feel about it and what she is not entitled to do about it. Her voice was steady. I'm not afraid of that conversation. It would be hard. I would have it anyway. He nodded slowly. Something in him loosened fractionally. Not all the way, not completely, but enough to breathe. Lily liked you, he said. She told me green is the best color. I feel we've established a foundation. She told me once that purple is the best color. Victoria's expression shifted. She told me green specifically. I think she tells different people different things to see what happens. She's 6 years old and she's already running social experiments. She definitely gets that from Laurel's side, Mason said, and then caught himself, and then realized Victoria was almost smiling, which meant it had landed as the dry observation he'd intended rather than the wound it could have been. She gets it from both sides, Victoria said. Don't undersell your contribution. Oh. The second complication had a less clean shape than Laurel. It was harder to name because it lived inside Mason rather than outside him, and the things that live inside are always more difficult to argue with than the things that live outside. He'd been a single father for 3 years. He had organized his entire life around that role, not resentfully, not with the martyrdom of someone performing sacrifice, but genuinely and by choice, because Lily was the most important thing and she deserved someone who showed up completely. He'd made peace with the narrowness of that life. He'd made peace with the loneliness of it too, eventually, in the way you make peace with a chronic condition, not by curing it, but by learning to function with it present. What he hadn't prepared for was what it felt like to have the loneliness start to lift, because the lifting was its own kind of destabilization. He'd built his equilibrium around the weight of it, and now that the weight was shifting, the equilibrium required recalibration, and that process was unsettling in ways he hadn't expected. He said some version of this to Victoria on a Sunday in May, not at Meridian, but on a bench in Fairmount Park, where they'd ended up after a Saturday coffee that ran long enough to flow into a walk. The park was busy, families, dogs, children on bikes, and they were sitting in a section of it that was slightly quieter, an older part with bigger trees that filtered the afternoon light into something softer. Lily was with Colin for the afternoon. Colin had started taking her every other Sunday since January, a thing he'd offered and Mason had accepted with more gratitude than he'd been able to express clearly. Colin and Lily had a dynamic that consisted mainly of Colin letting her make all the decisions and Lily taking full advantage of this, which resulted in afternoons of elaborate imaginary games that Colin reported back with a kind of bewildered wonder. I've been managing the loneliness for so long, Mason said, that I don't entirely know what to do with the fact that it's less. Victoria looked at the trees ahead of them. What does that feel like, specifically? Like I'm waiting for the other shoe. You're waiting for it to be taken away. Yeah, he exhaled. Which is rational, given your history. She said it without gentleness designed to soften the directness. Just honest. You loved someone and she left. The most logical inference your nervous system drew from that experience is that positive things depart. That's not weakness. That's pattern recognition from incomplete data. Incomplete data. One significant data point. That's not a pattern. That's an incident. She paused. I say that as someone who also drew overly broad conclusions from a limited data set. He looked at her. She was watching the park with the sideways quality she sometimes had when she was saying something that cost her something. Your marriage, he said. I was 31. He was someone who needed a great deal of admiration and became resentful when the admiration was not constant. I spent 4 years trying to become someone who required less and needed less and showed less, because those were the conditions under which he was easiest to be with. She paused. After it ended, I concluded that I was simply not someone who was suited to relationships, that my way of being in the world, direct, demanding, not particularly warm in the conventional sense, was incompatible with what relationships required. You believed that for how long? 18 years? She said it simply, without drama, with the occasional evidence-based reassessment that confirmed it. Evidence-based reassessment. I dated. It didn't work. I concluded my initial hypothesis was correct. A pause. I've recently had cause to question the methodology. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the park continued its Sunday business. A child somewhere behind them was laughing at something repetitively, the kind of laughing that children do when something strikes them as endlessly funny and adults can't always identify the source. I'm not good at the middle part, Mason said. What middle part? The part between knowing how I feel and knowing what to do about it. He turned to look at her. I'm good at deciding things once I have enough information. I'm not good at the period before I have enough information, when the situation is still forming. That's fairly common. It's annoying. Yes. She almost smiled. What information do you feel like you're missing? He thought about it. Whether this is something you want the way I want it. Whether I'm reading this correctly. Whether... He stopped. You said something weeks ago. At Meridian, the last time. You said you would want this and more of it. I haven't stopped thinking about that. I know, she said quietly. You know? I said it knowing you would think about it. I said it because it was true, and because I thought you deserved to have a true thing to think about, even if I couldn't offer more certainty than that at the time. Can you offer more certainty now? She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was in her eyes, and she didn't look away from it or from him. She was 50 years old, and she was tired in the specific way of someone who had been competent and self-sufficient for so long that the competence and self-sufficiency had become both armor and sell, and she knew it, and she was sitting in a park on a Sunday with a man who was 32, and had a daughter who gave fictional women fictional green dresses, and somehow, in the accounting of her life, this was the version of things that felt most real. Yes, she said. I can offer more certainty now. He let that sit for a moment. What does more certainty look like for you? It looks like this. She gestured fractionally at the bench, the park, the two of them. Not a declaration, not a roadmap, just a sustained intention to keep moving towards something instead of constructing reasons to move away from it. A pause. That's what I can give you right now. The intention and the honesty about where it comes from and what it costs me. What does it cost you? She was quiet for a longer moment than usual. The control, she said finally, over how this resolves. I can manage most outcomes in my professional life because I understand the variables. This has variables I don't control, and that is uncomfortable. For me, specifically. You've managed it pretty well so far. I've been pretending to manage it. There's a difference. She looked at him levelly. You should know that. I do know that. He paused. For what it's worth, I've been doing the same thing. I know you have. We're both bad at this. We are both highly functional people who are bad at this specific thing, she said. Yes. He laughed, the real kind, surprised out of him the way she occasionally managed. She didn't laugh, but her expression shifted into something that was closer to unguarded than he'd seen yet, and that was its own kind of thing. What followed was not a clean linear progression. It was messier than that, more human than that. There was a night in late May when Mason put Lily to bed and then sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes because the weight of everything, the Hartwell fallout still making the office uncomfortable, The 3-year anniversary of Laurel leaving, passing quietly and badly, a phone call from his mother in Dayton that had been loving and exhausting in equal measure, landed on him all at once in the way that things sometimes chose the worst possible moment to land. He texted Victoria at 10:15. Bad night. Nothing specific. Everything at once. She called 30 seconds later and talked with him until almost midnight about nothing important. An argument she'd had with a contractor about his office renovation. A memory of Laurel at 8 years old that was funny in hindsight. A question about whether Mason had ever tried to grow anything on his apartment balcony and why not. She didn't try to fix the bad night. She just sat with him in it until it was less, which was what it needed. There was a Sunday in June when Lily asked, with the directness of someone who had been thinking about a question for a while and decided it was time to ask it, "Is Miss Vicky your girlfriend?" Mason had said he wasn't sure yet, which was the honest answer. Lily had considered this and said, she knows a lot about dinosaurs for a grown-up, as though this were the relevant criterion, then gone back to her cereal. He'd texted Victoria the exchange verbatim. Her reply had been a long pause, and then, "What does she know about me that she identified that connection?" He'd written back, "I may have mentioned that you were the one who said Dr. Longneck had good bone structure." Another pause. "You told her I said that?" It came up naturally. "Mason, she took it well." A longer pause, and then, "Tell her Steggy also has excellent structural integrity." There was a dinner in early July where he cooked and she ate it without performing enthusiasm she didn't feel, which meant she had 3 helpings of the pasta and honest reservations about the salad dressing, which she expressed precisely and which he found he didn't mind even slightly. There was an afternoon where they argued, a real one, the first one, about something that had started as a discussion about how Mason handled the aftermath of the Hartwell situation at work, and evolved into something more personal about whether Mason's tendency to absorb professional conflict without visibly processing it was a sustainable coping strategy. She was direct in a way that pressed on something, and he pushed back harder than he meant to, and there was 20 minutes of both of them being too controlled and too pointed in equal measure. They stopped talking about it by unspoken agreement. He drove her home in a quiet that was different from their usual quiet. She got out of the car without resolving it, and he drove back to his apartment with the specific unpleasant feeling of an argument left unfinished. She texted at 11 that night. "I was direct in a way that wasn't fair. I have a habit of turning observations about people I care about into assessments, and that's not the same thing as concern, even when the underlying concern is real." He stared at the message, then typed, "I know you were right about the coping strategy. I just didn't want to hear it while I was still in the middle of it. That's fair. I should have waited. I should have said so instead of shutting down." A pause. "We're both learning this," she wrote. "Yeah," he typed. "We are." He set the phone down and sat with the reality of that this thing between them was not frictionless and was not going to become frictionless, that they were 2 people with ingrained habits and significant histories and strong opinions and real flaws trying to build something careful enough to hold the weight of all of that. That was not a small thing to try. It was in fact quite large. But he was not afraid of it the way he had been afraid of things before. The fear was still present. It was always present, small and persistent and honest. But it was no longer the largest thing in the room. The largest thing in the room was what he was choosing, and why, and who he was choosing it with. He turned off the light and went to bed. Outside, the July night was warm and quiet, and his apartment held the specific piece of a place where a child slept safely, and tomorrow was already organizing itself around coffee and an argument resolved and a woman who had said the people I care about without flinching and meant it. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. The call from Laurel came on a Thursday evening in the second week of August, which was not Lily's birthday and not Christmas and not any of the dates Mason had learned to anticipate, which meant it was something else. He was in the kitchen when his phone lit up with her name. Lily was at the table behind him, working on a drawing with total concentration, tongue slightly out the way it always was when she was focused, and Mason moved to the hallway before answering. "Hey," he said. "Hi." Laurel's voice was careful in the specific way it was always careful with him, not cold, but managed, the voice of someone monitoring themselves in real time. "Do you have a minute?" Sure, Lily's doing homework. Okay, a pause. I'm not going to do this badly, so I'm just going to say it directly. Patricia told me about the dinner. Mason was quiet. She didn't mean to. She mentioned something to a mutual friend who mentioned something to someone else. And it eventually got back to me that my mother had gone on a blind date in January and that the man turned out to be you. Another pause. And that you stayed. 3 hours. He leaned against the hallway wall. That's accurate? Mason. Her voice changed. Well, not angry, which was what he'd been bracing for. More complicated than that. Tired, maybe. Is there something happening between you and my mother? He could have deflected. He could have said, it's complicated, or we've had some conversations, or any number of technically true things that would have softened the edges. He thought about what Victoria had said in the park, that she would not be afraid of an honest conversation with Laurel, that she would have it anyway. He thought about the thing he'd learned slowly over the past 8 months, that the people who actually mattered to him got the true version. Yes, he said. The silence on the other end was long enough that he almost spoke into it. I see, Laurel said finally. I know this is strange. She exhaled. It's strange, Mason. You understand that. I do. She's my mother. I know who she is. And you're... She stopped. He could hear her working through something. You were my husband. I was. And then you left. He said it without accusation, which was something he'd worked toward for 3 years and hadn't fully achieved until somewhere around the 6th month of Saturdays at Meridian, when he'd found that the simple fact of it no longer carried the charge it used to. That's not a weapon, Laurel. I'm not throwing it at you. It's just what happened. You left, and I built a life after that, and this is part of that life now. Another long pause. Does Lily know her? She's met her once. She approved of her because Victoria told her Steggy had good structural integrity. He heard something on the other end. Not quite a laugh, but a sound adjacent to one. A very brief escape of something human in the managed voice. That sounds like my mother, Laurel said quietly. Yeah. He waited. Laurel, I'm not asking your permission. I want you to understand that clearly. But I also don't want this to become something that damages what we have with Lily. That's the only thing I've ever cared about protecting. I know that. Her voice was different now. Lower, less careful. You've always been better at that than I have. He didn't respond to that. There was nothing to respond to. Is she... Laurel stopped. Is she good to you? The question surprised him. He hadn't expected her to ask it, and the asking of it told him something about where Laurel was in her own journey. Some version of her that was further along than the version that had left, still in progress, still imperfect, but asking questions she wouldn't have asked before. Yes, he said. She is. Okay. A pause. Okay. Another pause. Longer. I'm going to need some time with this. That's honest. That's fair. I'll still call Lily on her birthday. I know you will. Mason. Her voice was quieter now, and something in it had dropped the management entirely, just the voice of a person. She stopped. I know the way things ended was not fair to you. I've known that for a long time. I haven't known how to say it. He stood in his hallway with the noise of Lily drawing in the kitchen behind him, and he let the words arrive and settle. 3 years ago, those words would have meant something enormous to him. They would have been the thing he hadn't known he was waiting for. Now they meant something different. Smaller, maybe, but more honest. The wound had already changed character, the way Victoria had said it would. The words came too late to be a rescue, but they were still worth something. They were the truth, and the truth was still worth something even when it arrived late. Thank you for saying that, he said. It matters. Tell Lily I'll call Sunday. I'll tell her. They hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked back into the kitchen, and Lily looked up from her drawing with the assessing expression of a child who knows something happened but isn't sure what. Who was that? Your mom. She's calling Sunday. Lily processed this with her characteristic equanimity, the comfortable acceptance of the shape her family had always been. Is she coming to visit? Not right now. Okay. She looked back down at her drawing, then back up. Dad? Yeah? Can Miss Vicky come to my dinosaur birthday party? Mason looked at her. Her birthday was in October. It was currently August. She had apparently been planning a dinosaur-themed party for longer than she had told him. I'll ask her, he said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing with the settled confidence of someone who considers the important arrangements already made. He called Victoria that night at 9 after Lily was asleep and told her about the conversation with Laurel in the same way he'd learned to tell Victoria things. The true version, not the edited one. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How do you feel?" "Better than I expected," he considered. "Laurel asking if you were good to me. I didn't see that coming." "She loves you," Victoria said quietly. "Not the way you needed her to love you, and not in a way that made her capable of staying, but in her way." A pause. "That's something I've come to understand about her. She's not indifferent to the people she leaves. She's just more frightened of staying than she is of hurting them. That's not an excuse, it's an explanation." "There's a difference between those things," he said. "There is." He was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, August was doing what it did, heavy and warm and full of the specific sound of a city that hadn't yet started bracing for fall. She said she needed time. She'll take it, and then she'll adjust. Laurel is not, despite everything, someone who stays in one position indefinitely. She moves. Slowly, and not always in the right direction, but she moves. You know her very well. I know the part she's let me know. A pause, softer now, which is less than I'd like and more than it used to be. He heard something in that, the particular wistfulness of a parent who loves a child at a distance that the child set and the parent learned to respect without surrendering the love. He thought about Lily, currently asleep 4 doors down, and the specific terror of imagining that becoming his reality, the distance becoming permanent and uncrossable. He didn't know how Victoria had carried that for years. He had more respect for it than he could easily articulate. She also, he said, has been invited to a dinosaur birthday party in October. A pause. I'm sorry? Lily would like you to come to her birthday party, which is dinosaur-themed, which I didn't know about until tonight. Another pause. How long has she been planning this party? Unknown. I have the feeling the planning predates my involvement by some margin. She's 6 years old. 7 in October. She's 6 years old and she is orchestrating social events. A pause. Mason, I said this before and I will say it again. That child is going to be remarkable. You can tell her that yourself in October. A longer pause, and in it he could hear her doing what she did. The internal calculation not of whether to say yes, but of what yes would mean, what it would cost, what it would require. He'd learned to wait through those pauses now without filling them. The answer at the end was worth the wait. Yes, she said. I'll be there. The conversation with Laurel had loosened something. Not everything. It didn't resolve 3 years of complexity into something clean, because nothing does that. But it moved the last large obstacle from actively threatening to present but navigable, which was the honest version of what resolution looked like. Mason had spent enough time now, in and out of difficult situations, to know that most things didn't resolve into clean space. They resolved into manageable space, and manageable was enough to build in. September was the month things shifted from careful to something more openly themselves. Victoria had dinner at Mason's apartment 4 times. Not occasions, actual dinners, the kind where the food was sometimes very good and sometimes not, where Lily asked relentless questions about the Cretaceous period and Victoria answered them with more paleontological specificity than Mason could follow, where the 3 of them ended up on the living room floor at some point looking at a dinosaur book that Lily had very strong feelings about, and that Mason had read enough times to have memorized the first 7 pages. He watched Victoria with Lily and felt things he didn't try to organize or name. Just let them be what they were, large and warm and complicated, the way the real things always were. He started spending occasional evenings at her apartment, which was on the 14th floor of a building in the northern part of the city and was very clean and very well organized in a way that felt like a portrait of her inner life, a place where every object was intentional and there was space between things. She had a small balcony with 2 chairs and a view of the city that she used when she needed to think. She took him out there one evening in mid-September, and they sat in those chairs and looked at the city together without saying much. And it was the specific, comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill the space between them. "Do you know what I've been thinking about?" she said. "Tell me." "The dinner. At Alderton's." She looked at the city. "I had a moment right after I saw you, maybe 30 seconds in, where I thought, if I stand up right now, I can say I have an emergency and I can be out of this building before this becomes anything. I could feel myself running the scenario." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was curious." She paused. "I'd spent 18 years not being curious about people. And then you were standing at that table and you looked—" She stopped. "You looked like someone who was trying very hard not to show that he was as caught off guard as I was. And I found that, I don't know, I found it real. I hadn't expected real." He looked at her profile against the city lights. "I almost left in the parking structure before I went in." She turned to look at him. "What stopped you?" "I told myself I was doing Colin a favor, giving him the satisfaction of knowing I'd tried." A pause. "I was lying to myself. The actual reason is that I'd been sitting with the same weight for 3 years and I was tired of it. And some part of me decided that an uncomfortable dinner was less exhausting than another evening with the weight." He looked at the city. "I had no idea I was walking into something that was going to matter." "Neither did I." She looked back at the lights. "I've thought about the mechanics of it, how unlikely it was. Your friend didn't know my name. My friend didn't know yours. 2 separate well-meaning people on different sides of a complicated history, each trying to help someone they cared about, each with no idea what they were doing." A pause. "I don't believe in fate in the cosmic sense, but I find the mechanics interesting." "What do you make of it?" She considered. "I make of it that most of the things that actually matter arrive through side doors, not the ones we left open on purpose, the ones we forgot to lock." She paused. "That's either comforting or terrifying, depending on the day." "Today?" She turned to look at him, and in the city light her face was unguarded in the way he'd been earning slowly for months. No performance, no management, no careful composition, just her. "Today it's comforting," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. She let him. They sat there a while longer, while the city went on below them in its enormous indifference, full of its own thousands of side doors and forgotten locks and unexpected arrivals. October came, and with it, Lily's 7th birthday. The party was on a Saturday afternoon, and Lily had been specific about its requirements. Dinosaurs, obviously. A cake shaped like a volcano. Green decorations because green was the best color. The guest list, which Lily had curated herself, consisted of 4 children from her class: Colin, Dana, the upstairs babysitter, Mason's mother, who had driven in from Dayton the day before, and Miss Vicky. Mason's mother, whose name was Ruth and who had been watching her son with a careful maternal intelligence for his entire life, had been told about Victoria 2 weeks prior. The call had gone better than he'd expected and produced the response that he'd learned to expect from his mother, which was a single directional question. "Is she good to you and to Lily?" He'd said yes. She'd said, "Then I'm glad." And that had been that, because Ruth Calloway had never been a woman who needed more information than was relevant, a quality her son had inherited incompletely and was still working on. Victoria arrived at noon with a wrapped gift that turned out to be a comprehensive illustrated encyclopedia of prehistoric life that was, in Lily's immediate assessment, the best thing anyone had ever given her. She held it with both arms and informed Victoria that she could come to her parties every year, which Victoria accepted with a gravity that honored the weight of the offer. Mason watched this from across the living room and felt the accumulated presence of everything in his chest. His mother laughing with Colin, Lily explaining the superiority of the Stegosaurus to 2 of her classmates with a level of passion that was frankly impressive, the apartment full of noise and color, and the specific beautiful chaos of a child who was genuinely loved by the people around her. Victoria appeared at his side. You're going to make the face, she said quietly. What face? The face where you look at all of this and something happens in your expression that you don't control. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the room. You've been making it for about 30 seconds. I don't know what face you're talking about. You do. He did. He looked at the room and let himself feel what he was feeling without trying to organize it first. The gratitude and the tenderness and the specific, particular wonder of having arrived somewhere you didn't plan to be and finding that it was exactly where you needed to be. It wasn't a perfect picture. His mother had brought the wrong flavor of coffee cake, and he'd had to quietly find a place for it in the cabinet. One of Lily's classmates had already cried once and been consoled and was fine now. The volcano cake was listing slightly to one side and had to be positioned carefully on the table so it looked intentional. Nothing was smooth, nothing was perfect. It was just real, which was the only version of any of this that had ever mattered. "Thank you for coming today," he said. She turned to look at him. "Lily invited me. I believe she issued a formal directive." "You know what I mean." She did know. He could see it in the way she held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the room. "I know what you mean." His mother materialized on his other side with the specific teleportation ability that mothers develop after decades of monitoring rooms. She was 61 and had her son's eyes and a directness that was friendly rather than surgical. And she'd been quietly cataloging Victoria for the past 40 minutes with the subtlety of a woman who had been doing this kind of assessment her entire adult life. "Victoria," she said with the warmth of someone who has already made a decision, "Mason tells me you're in consulting." "Strategic consulting, yes." Victoria extended a hand and his mother took it. "And you drove in from Dayton." "It's a 4-hour drive and my granddaughter is turning 7. I've made it for worse reasons." Ruth looked at Mason with the brief, fond exasperation of a parent who has watched her child complicate his own life for 3 decades. "He didn't tell me you were this composed. He just said smart and direct." She glanced back at Victoria, "Which is accurate but incomplete." "Mom," Mason said. "I'm complimenting her," Ruth said mildly. Victoria almost smiled. "I appreciate that. He was accurate, if economical." "He's economical about everything that matters," Ruth said. "Gets it from his father." She looked at Lily across the room, who was now arranging the encyclopedia on the table next to the volcano cake with the specific care of someone who considers both items of equal ceremonial importance. "She's wonderful, Mason." "I know," he said. "Her mother's eyes," Ruth said. "But the way she moves around a room, the way she thinks, that's all you." He didn't say anything. Ruth squeezed his arm once, briefly, and moved toward Lily with the ease of a grandmother who knew exactly where she was needed. Mason and Victoria stood side by side in the noise and the color and the excellent disaster of the party. Not touching, not performing anything, just present together in the life that had built itself around them in the months since January. "Your mother is formidable," Victoria said. "She really is. She approved of me in about 90 seconds. She approved of you before she met you. She just confirmed it in 90 seconds. A pause. How did she approve of me before meeting me? Because I was happy. He said it simply, the way simple things needed to be said when you finally found the right moment to say them. She's been watching me not be happy for 3 years, and then I was. She didn't need the details. Victoria was quiet. He turned to look at her, and she was watching the room with the expression she had when she was holding something she didn't know how to put down yet. Victoria. She looked at him. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "I'm bad at speeches, and we're at a 7-year-old's dinosaur party, and I'm pretty sure Lily is about to redirect everyone to the cake." "She's been positioning herself near the table for the last 4 minutes," Victoria confirmed, "so I'll say it quickly." He looked at her directly, the way she'd always looked at him. No performance, no careful composition, just the truth in the plainest language available. "I love you." That's not a declaration requiring a response. It's just, it's true, and you should know it's true. And I wanted to say it once clearly so we're both working from the same information. She looked at him for a long moment. The party went on around them. Collins laughed from across the room, Lily's voice announcing that it was cake time with the authority of someone who had been managing this event since she was 6.5. And neither of them moved. "I know," she said, And then, quietly, I love you too. That also requires no response. I just want you to have that information. He nodded. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Lily appeared between them from nowhere, as Lily tended to do, grabbing one of each of their hands with the proprietary ease of someone who considers both people fundamentally hers. It's cake time, she announced. I need everyone to come look at the volcano. The volcano looks great, Bug, Mason said. It's leaning a little, Lily said, with total acceptance of this fact. But Dad says imperfect things are still good things. Victoria looked at Mason. It's a thing I tell her, he said. When did you start telling her that? He thought about it. Probably around January. She looked at him, and something in her expression was entirely open. No armor, no managed composure, just a person who had been alone inside her own precision for a long time and had found, in the most unexpected geometry imaginable, a place where the precision and the imperfection could exist at the same time without one defeating the other. He thought it was the most honest thing he'd ever seen on another person's face. Come on, Lily said, tugging both their hands. The volcano is waiting. They let her lead them across the room. The volcano cake was cut, and the birthday song was sung, and Lily blew out 7 candles with one enormous breath, and then looked up with the specific, radiant satisfaction of someone who has just accomplished something significant. Ruth photographed everything. Colin got frosting on his shirt and blamed Lily, who denied all responsibility with the confidence of someone who knows the evidence is circumstantial. One of the small guests fell asleep on the couch by 4 o'clock. The prehistoric encyclopedia was consulted twice during the party by Lily and once by Victoria, which Lily noted with approval. By 6 in the evening, the guests had gone. Ruth was staying in the spare room, Dana had helped clean up and gone back upstairs, and Lily was sitting in the wreckage of the living room still holding the encyclopedia and showing signs of being too tired to sleep, which was the specific state she reached on significant days. Mason sat on the floor next to her while she showed him a page about the Jurassic period, walking him through information she already knew and was now confirming in print. Victoria sat on the couch behind them, and at some point Lily leaned back against Mason's shoulder and the encyclopedia tipped toward her chest and her eyes started losing their focus, and she said, in a voice that was already half asleep, Miss Vicky should come to my birthday every year. You already told her that, Mason said quietly. I'm telling her again, Lily said, because I mean it. He looked up at Victoria. She was looking at Lily with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not composed, not careful, not any of the managed versions of herself he'd spent months learning to see past. Just open, just undefended, just a person who had been given something she hadn't let herself expect and didn't know what to do with except hold it very carefully. Every year, Victoria said, I'll be here. Lily nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes, and Mason sat on the floor of his living room while his daughter fell asleep against him and the October evening came down outside the windows, and he held the whole of this, the imperfect, arrived at sideways against all reasonable planning reality of his life, and he felt it as the thing it actually was. Not luck, not fate, not a story he would have written if you'd given him the outline in advance, because he would have edited out the blind date and the ex-wife's mother and the 3 difficult years and all the parts that didn't look like a plan, and he would have ended up with something cleaner and emptier and false. The truth was that the things that mattered had come through the side doors. The side door had been a restaurant reservation made by 2 people who meant well and didn't know enough. The side door had been staying when every reasonable instinct said to leave. The side door had been a woman who said I find them valuable and meant it, who said I never thought it was your fault and meant that too, who stood in his kitchen at a 7-year-old's birthday party with her composure entirely down and her eyes on his sleeping daughter, and meant everything she had never been fully able to say out loud. He had spent a long time believing that love required perfect conditions, that it required the right timing, the right history, the right variables aligning correctly before you allowed yourself to step into it. He'd treated his own heart like a contract that needed all the terms defined before he could sign. What he knew now, what he'd learned in the incremental, imperfect, argument-inclusive, occasionally uncomfortable way that real things were learned, was that the conditions were never perfect. The conditions were never going to be perfect. You stepped in anyway, or you didn't step in at all, and there were things that only existed on the other side of the stepping. Lily was breathing slowly now. Mason shifted slightly so she was more comfortable against his shoulder without waking her. "She's out," he said quietly. "She fought it for about 20 minutes, Victoria said. "I was tracking. She always fights it on good days. She doesn't want to miss anything." Victoria looked at the two of them. She didn't miss anything. He smiled. Not the careful version, not the one he put on for rooms and situations. The real one, the private one that he'd gotten better at letting out since January. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for all of it." "Stop thanking me," she said, not unkindly. "I mean it. I know you do. That's why I'm telling you to stop. You don't need to thank me for being somewhere I want to be." He looked at her. She looked back. The October evening was entirely quiet now, outside the windows, the city doing its soft nighttime thing, the apartment holding the warmth of a day well spent in it. There was no resolution in the sense of a problem being solved. There was just this, the specific, earned, imperfect reality of two people who had walked through enough to know what mattered, sitting in a room where a child slept with her birthday encyclopedia and a volcano cake with a slight lean waited in the kitchen, and the rest of it, all of it, was still to come. Not despite the difficulty. Because of it. Because it had been the difficulty that had asked them both to be real, and the realness that had made it mean something, and the meaning that had made it worth the side doors and the wrong reservations, and the uncomfortable hours, and all the months of learning each other in the careful, honest, occasionally painful way that anything true required. This was what second chances actually looked like. Not grand, not clean, not the version where everything resolved into softness and ease and none of the old scars remained. Just two adults and a sleeping child in an apartment in October, choosing each other in the plain, steady, daily way that was the only kind of choosing that held. That was enough. That was everything.